One thing that I wanted to state up front, if you attended last month was a no slides presentation. It was excellent. Dived right into the code. I'm going to make up for that this month. This is going to be a heavy slides presentation, largely just because of the topic. I know that there's been a long history of working with user stories, and some people have had some frustration with stories and their size and complexity and being able to actually define value for their customers. So I've presented this talk um, actually several years ago, and so this is a revision and really focused on what makes a good user story and what are some of the key strategies for splitting a user story. That tends to not involve a lot of code or an IDE, so we're going to work off slides today. Um, as Steve said, I'm a director of engineering for Ecovia. That's a company that builds case management software and business analytics in the case management social services space. I love what I do. Um, I love being a developer. I've found that as a director of engineering, I spend most of my time doing Python to scrape various reports, which isn't the funnest kind of development, but it certainly gives me an opportunity um, to make a difference in the way the company works. And we are in a period of some growth. We are hiring, so if you at the end of the presentation, I'll post a chat and the link to our hiring site. Uh, you can reach me on the site formerly known as Twitter at Geek Cyclist. My GitHub's on the screen here. I will post the slides to the chat for the meetup or to the discussion for the meetup. And I do occasionally blog, very occasionally, at agilecoder.net. I think it's probably been close to 2 years since I last posted there, but those are places where you can get a hold of me and see other writings and thoughts that I've had. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about just the history of user stories to kick things off, and recognize that there was a lot of cross pollination happening in around 1997, the late 90s, as developers had started to discover that the way we were gathering requirements, the way we were managing projects, and the way we were trying to deliver value to customers really wasn't working that well. And one of the key groups or drivers of the shift was Kent Beck and a project at Chrysler, the Chrysler C3 project. And Kent's is typically credited with the introduction of stories as part of extreme programming. And some of the other things that were collected as part of extreme programming are pairing, some test-driven development, and it was really kind of a revolutionary idea at the time. Another idea that was developing at the time was the use of personas. And Alan Cooper, in his book, The Inmates Are Running the Asylum, does a great job of discussing how, as IT professionals and developers, we frequently are not the best people to determine what a system should be doing if we're looking at it from our perspective. And developed the idea of creating personas, actually very detailed personas. Again, kind of a revolutionary idea. Um, in that same window, Ron Jeffries is credited with the triple C idea. Again, very closely tied to user stories of coming up with a card, conversation, and confirmation. Sometimes you'll see this as criteria of satisfaction or acceptance criteria. Rachel Davies is credited in that same early 2000s period of coming up with the story template that many of us are familiar with, and we'll talk about story templates in just a little bit. But the as a user and adding so that to collect value in the early 2000s. And again, this is all about the same time that how a group of software leaders got together here in Snowbird and came up with the Agile Manifesto. And this would typically be the time where I would post a screenshot of the Agile Manifesto and go through the manifesto. We're not going to do that. I assume that everybody's heard of the Agile Manifesto, is familiar with the principles and precepts, and probably has strong opinions about how effective or ineffective everything being agile has been. I just wanted to give you the context of this was the same time period. Then a key factor in the development of user stories is Mike Cohn synthesizing all of this existing information and writing a book. His book is User Stories Applied, and he's accredited with creating a couple of the mnemonics we're going to use, we're going to talk through later during this presentation. And then finally, another great resource. The ideas originated around 2005. There were blog posts that Jeff Patton wrote around 2008. And then in 2014, he published the book User Story Mapping, which is a great look at moving from user stories to hierarchies and planning and road mapping. So those are some great resources and kind of just a look at the history of user stories and how they developed. Uh, so let's talk a little bit about what is a user story. There are certainly as many definitions of that as there are people in this meeting, and probably many, many more. A common definition is a user story is a brief, simple description of a feature from the end user's perspective, capturing what they want to achieve. And I like that. I like that definition. I like to think about it though from the developer perspective. We write the stories from the user perspective, but from a developer perspective, I like to think of it as a user story captures how you want your work to change the world by changing the interactions that people have and the value that people receive from interacting with your system. And it's that interactions that they have and the value that they receive, I think, is key. The best user stories include not only a what someone wants to accomplish or what someone wants to do, but the why that someone wants to do it. What's the value that they actually receive? A key point to remember is stories are not requirements docs. The intent of a user story is not to capture every single detail and every small facet of the requirements for the system. A user story is actually a pointer to the requirements. Going back to that triple C, it's a card, a conversation, and criteria. It captures the conversations that need to be had about the requirements. So let's look at some sample stories for hopefully a domain that everybody can understand relatively easily. Let's look at some sample stories for a gradebook application. So these stories, starting off with, as a teacher, I want to enter grades for assignments and exams so that I can maintain an up-to-date record of student performance. As a teacher, I want to have final grades automatically calculated based on weighted averages so that I can ensure accuracy and consistency. And that user story is specifically for my wife, who claims to be significantly math challenged and would never be able to create accurate grades for her students if she had to do the math herself on a calculator. And we have another story. As a teacher, I want to leave feedback on assignments so that students understand their strengths and areas for improvement. So again, all of these stories use the template that's attributed to Rachel Davies. It's the as a some role or some user persona. I want some action or behavior that I want to take, or some result that I want, so that, and then the behavior that, or the, sorry, the value that I want to achieve or receive from taking the action that the user story captures. Um, Now that's not a requirement that user stories be in this format. There are many others. Chris Matz is attributed to the hunting the value format, where it kind of flips the items around. So Chris Matz uses uh, in order to receive some benefit as a role or persona, I can, and then there's your goal or your desire, what you want to achieve. Another format is the W's format of who, where, doing what, and why. And that's a format that I've seen. I worked on a team that used that format for a short time. It was appreciated because it's similar to the given, when, then format of acceptance tests. The key thing is not necessarily the format. The key thing is that it is that in some way you capture a very brief statement of what you want to have accomplished by interacting with your system, and then, if possible, capture the value that would be added by your interaction with the system. I do want to highlight, for those of us who've been around in the industry for a long time, uh, these user stories aren't necessarily that different from what we would have seen in the past, listed sometimes as just requirements or functional specifications. Each of these stories on the left matches, a functional requirement on the right. The system shall allow a teacher to enter grades for assignments and exams. The system shall calculate final grades based on weighted average. The system shall allow a teacher to leave feedback on assignments. I, Again, I think those are valuable. And there's nothing necessarily wrong if you're working on a team that works in collecting your requirements in that format. But I do think there's key value in adding a particular persona, and we'll talk about that a little bit in when we talk about characteristics of a story, and again, maybe most importantly, identifying the value that they receive. Now, one thing that comes up pretty quickly or early when we talk about stories is, what about stories from a developer standpoint? So here's an example of what we would think of a typical requirement that we as developers think about when we're building a system, but aren't frequently thought about by a product owner or a business analyst. In this case, all connections to the database are through a connection pool. Now, most of us on the call, we could probably point out any number of ways that using a connection pool to minimize our actual connections to the database is valuable. The problem is, when I sit down with a product owner and I have all connections to the database or through a connection pool as one of the requirements that I want to prioritize, it's really difficult for the product owner to see the value of that and to recognize the priority that should be attributed to a story like that. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's not always possible to capture these kind of developer focused requirements as user stories, but it's often worth making a valiant attempt, particularly if we can think of these not necessarily from the perspective of the developer themselves, but from a particular persona. So in this case, we could say, as a sponsor or funder of the system, I want it to be usable by 100 users with a 10 user database license so that we minimize our license costs. Now, that has very specific value, and I can sit with a product owner And a product owner should be able to see that there is a direct connection to the cost of building or hosting or licensing, for our customers, licensing our system, if we're able to minimize the number of connections by using connection pooling. But they have no idea what connection pooling is. We're able to capture that in the idea of usable by 100 users with a 10 user database license. So I want to take a brief digression into personas, and tell you a little story. So um, a lot of user stories just start with "as a user." Sometimes they'll have "as a specific class of users." So as a um, as an accounting user by department, or as a novice user by level of skill. I would suggest that there can be tremendous value by actually getting very detailed with your personas, describing them as real people, getting to the level of detail where you have names, pictures, and descriptions of some of their motivations. Let me give you a particular example of an interaction that I have almost every night, um, with a an application that I'm fairly certain did not use specific personas. My wife and I have a sleep number bed. It's over the years we've upgraded a couple of times. I think this may be our third sleep number bed. We have a fancy adjustable. And obviously one of the key features of a sleep number bed is you can adjust the firmness. When we bought our first one, it came with a physical remote, and the physical remote um, basically had an up button, a down button, and a favorite button, and you could just feel the button, push the favorite button, and if you wanted to save your current setting as your favorite, you held the favorite button down. I think was the way the remote worked. We upgraded to a bed that you could buy a remote separately, but you didn't have to. You could use the Sleep Number app on your phone. So we thought, great, we'll try the Sleep Number app on our phone. And the Sleep Number app was a relatively simple user interface, and had great big icons or buttons that you could tap to hit to modify your settings. Now, I want to say about 6 or 8 months ago, the Sleep Number app got a significant update. And when it got the significant update, one of the first things that happened is the buttons moved around. But the second thing that happened is um, um, buttons changed size. So the issue is, they don't have a user persona for Grandpa Gary, who wears glasses during the day but takes his glasses off as soon as he goes to bed at night. And I have two key problems. Number one, I normally can't find the favorites button, for the firmness of the mattress. It's too small. I can't hit it in the dark with my glasses off. And the second is, even if I can navigate to the settings for the adjustable bed, um, the button to say go to my favorite setting is in a different location from the button for go to my favorite setting in the firmness. So in fact, whenever I try to, in the middle of the night, adjust the bed to my favorite setting, what I actually end up doing is saving the current setting as my new favorite setting. So that's a kind of a long digression maybe about why I think it's really important to get as specific as you feel comfortable with your personas. I think spending some significant time saying these are the people that we're trying to serve in these ways and these are their motivations can be very, very useful. And it helps you avoid some of the blind spots that we have as developers. Now, another thing is that your users are not necessarily customers. Customers may have different needs from your users. So, a user is somebody who actually uses your application or your system. A customer may represent the purchaser of the system. So, in my case, I represent a customer of a lot of systems, and as an IT director, I need my system administrators to be able to remotely wipe a phone that's been lost or stolen to protect company resources. It's still a need. It's still a significant value, but I'm not a direct user of the system. And so stories, what we typically call user stories, can be valuable for people who are not users. Sponsors is another example. So this would be a person representing payment for or development of the system. As the sponsor of our SaaS gradebook management system, I want it to pass a NIST 853 audit. So we can tout our security and risk management capabilities in a sales presentation. So just as we go through stories, or as you go through stories, recognize that the direct users of your system may not be the only people whose needs you need to take into consideration. Another example that I've seen in the past is the evil user story. So this would be writing a story from the standpoint of a hacker. So maybe the opposite of our sponsor story. You could think of a hacker writing a story, or a story from the point of view of a hacker as being, as an identity thief, I want to access user PII to sell on the dark web. And this can be a useful story to consider, maybe even as an epic to break out particular security stories that again can be shown as valuable to your product owner. So, with that short digression into personas, I want to talk a little bit about what make up the key factors of a good user story. And so this mnemonic comes from Mike Cohn and his user stories applied. And he listed out invest as a good way to remember what are the characteristics of a good user story. Um, we can start with a good user story should be independent. They should be self-contained. The best user stories can be picked up off the backlog and developed in any order. User stories should be negotiable. Stories and their confirmation criteria should not be considered as set in stone and should be adapted through discussions with stakeholders. And again, back to one of our key factors or characteristics, user stories should be valuable. They should capture and provide value to the end user or the customer. And I'm going to change the mnemonic just a little bit, just because I personally have long disliked estimable, primarily because estimable also means that something can be held in high esteem. And I use essentially the made up word estimatable. Stories should be clear enough to allow for estimation of effort required. And that estimation should be however your team normally estimates stories. If you do t-shirt sizes, if you do story points, if you do person hours, developer hours, or days, whatever the metric is that you use for estimation, the story should be clear enough to allow your team to estimate the level of effort required. And then another thing that I like to differentiate, again, frequently you see this as small. I think more frequently now, if you did a list and search for invest, you'd probably see sized appropriately. I think it's taking over, and that is stories need to be sized for their current use, particularly sized small enough to be completed in a single iteration. Now, as we talk about sizing, and that's the main point of this talk, is we need to remember that a story that's deep, deep in the backlog that we're not worried about developing in any of our, maybe our now next or the next couple of future iterations. Um, does not have to have a particularly high level of detail. We don't have to worry about sizing it appropriately. As it moves up our backlog and gets higher and higher in priority, we can then look at whether or not the story needs to be split into smaller sizes, or whether it's similar enough to other stories that it should be combined with other stories. Once a story is bubbling up to the top of our backlog, it is important that it be sized small enough to be completed in a single iteration. And so this is linked to our estimatable and our velocity. If we're using points and our team is normally doing 15 points in a sprint or an iteration, or if we're using hours and we normally do 120 hours of two devs full time, we want to have our stories sized small enough that they can be completed in that iteration. Even better, I think it's ideal if we can have them have stories sized small enough that multiple stories can be tackled in an iteration. Our rule on teams that I've been on has normally been to target a a size of about 1/4 to 1/3 of the velocity of the team per story. Now, we very frequently don't hit that. We frequently have stories that are larger than 1/4 or 1/3. And in fact, later we'll talk about a story that you likely may not be able to split small enough to fit into a single iteration. But I do think it's a good rule to target some much smaller size than your full velocity. I think there's significant risk if you end up with stories frequently sized to capture the full velocity or full capacity of your team for an iteration. Because when you do that, any small delay, any small complication means that you're going to carry that story over. You're going to likely go an iteration where you can't deliver value to your customers. Another brief story. Several years ago, I attended a conference, and at the conference, one of the booths in the vendor booths was giving away a set of planning poker cards. Again, this is an idea that kind of came out of the early 2000s revolution and movement towards agile. And many of you may be familiar with planning poker cards or planning poker app, where you use a Fibonacci series of 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on, until you get to super big sizes like 40 or 100 or infinity. And this set of planning poker cards is my favorite set of planning poker cards. It has only 3 cards per person. It has one TFB for too frighteningly big, or NFC for no freaking clue. And I think it's hyperbole, but the one of the principals of that company was giving a talk at the conference where they talked about estimates and story points, and made the point that they try to keep their stories as small as possible, that one is their ideal size, that if you can't get down to one, it's likely means that you don't fully understand your story, or you're trying to do too much in the story. I don't hold to that rule firmly. I do, however, have a stack of those cards and have given them to most of the product owners that I've dealt with over the years, and they generally enjoy that. Finally, in invest, after sized appropriately, we have testable. The story should have clear acceptance criteria to confirm when they're done. And it doesn't need to be a single acceptance criteria. It can be multiple acceptance criteria. It's important to note, and you may have picked that up as I talked about some of these characteristics of a story. Not all stories have to include each factor. Invest is a tool to help us build good, high quality user stories, to help us direct our efforts as we do, but it's not a golden standard that we have to hit. It's not the center of a bullseye that every story has to be independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, sized appropriately, and testable. Negotiable is key here. All factors are somewhat adjustable and negotiable. So let's move on and talk a little bit about reasons why we want to size and split. We we talked about sizing stories appropriately. There are a number of reasons that we're trying to split stories into manageable sizes. The first is to reduce the risk. Like I just said, if we have stories that are too big, one of the risks we have is that we get a complication and we can't deliver value in the iteration. Another risk is it can have too many factors for us to tackle in a single sprint. Um, we also split stories to facilitate prioritization. Some factors in a large story, if we can split it into smaller stories, we can determine that some part of the story is of higher value and should be done earlier than other factors of the story. Uh, in the same vein, we split stories to enable incremental delivery. And then finally, we can split stories to manage complexity. This is again tightly tied to reducing the risk and enabling that incremental delivery. I do want to give an example. I lived kind of across the street from a medical research facility, and made friends with one of the developers that worked there. And she shared with me a story that she had once as she was developing some of their software that managed some of the instruments that were used in this lab. And I don't remember the exact details of how these instruments work, but the main gist of the story was, as a user of some computerized lab device, I need the device to self-correct if it detects that measurements are out of the accepted tolerance. And when we go through some of the techniques to split stories, we'll come back to why this is a story that may be so complex that it's not possible to split it in a way that makes the work completable in a single iteration. So we're going to work through a couple of examples. One main example, and work through some techniques for how to size and split a story. So I want to start out with the key story of, as a user, I want to manage my personal library so that I can easily track and organize my books. Now, I think we can all recognize that's probably not a great story. That's at least an epic, and it may be bigger. We may be describing the entire application that we want to develop. Um, there's just far too much going on in this story. So let's consider that an epic, and we'll work through a couple of quick stories here that are samples of how we could split that, and then we'll go through some specific techniques that get us to these smaller stories. So if we consider that an epic, as a user, I want to manage my personal library so that I can easily track and organize my books. A couple of stories, and I won't read through all of these, but a couple of stories are, as a user, I want to add new books to my library so that I can keep track of what I own. As a user, I want to remove books from my library so that it only includes what I currently have. Or I want to edit book details. As a user, I want to mark books as read or currently reading or to be read so that I can track my reading progress. And so, as developers, we can probably recognize some of these stories just right off the bat. We could think of one technique we could use to split this large epic into smaller stories is just think along the lines of our CRUD activities, our create, read, update, delete activities. And that's a perfectly valid technique for splitting stories. It can be very useful. Um, One here is, as a user, I want to search for a book by title or author so that I can quickly locate it in my library. That doesn't exactly match a CRUD story, but it gives us a particular activity with a particular benefit for the particular user. And then we could debate as a development team in our sprint planning or our backlog refinement whether these stories are the appropriate size. Again, with a target of if we had 1 to 2 developers on our team working anywhere from a half day to X weeks, where X is the size of our typical iteration, would that story fit in our iteration? Um, so with those examples, let's talk about the next mnemonic that Mike Cohen introduced, and that mnemonic is spider. And I apologize for any people who are super afraid of spiders, but I think that's a great graphic. I um, I have a general truce with spiders. They're great outside my house. I'm a little uncomfortable with them inside my house, but I have a no touching policy if they're inside my house. So um, I'm hoping that I don't have nightmares from this graphic. But the blog post here is a pretty detailed explanation of the tools that Mike Cohn laid out that are represented by the mnemonic spider. Now we'll go through those. We'll go through these each fairly quickly, one by one. Um, the S in spider refers to spike. And the goal of a spike is to gather information to reduce uncertainty. We want to make sure that we have the best information we have when we go ahead with implementing features. And there may be places where we have a high level of uncertainty. We use these as discovery stories. The primary use on the teams that I work with are to use a spike to inform a go or no go decision for implementing a large feature or an epic. So thinking about our previous set of personal library management app, a spike could be, as a developer, I need to research best practices for storing book metadata to better understand storage and interface requirements. Two things about spikes. One is I like to make sure that I add a pointer from the spike back to the story that spawned the spike, so that the information that we gather in a spike is linked. And then another thing, particularly as leaders of a team, if you are finding that you are doing very frequent spikes, that may be a story smell, and we'll talk about story smells in just a little bit. It's it's key to understand that not every iteration should need a spike. Spikes are intended to handle a significant body of unknowns or uncertainty, not the normal level of uncertainty that we have as developers of just of here's a feature and I'm not entirely sure how to implement the feature, but if we talk for 10 or 15 minutes on a whiteboard with a whiteboard between us maybe or talk over IM with a remote member, we can probably come to a pretty good solution. That's not a good spot for a spike. Spikes should be significant areas of uncertainty. The next letter in the mnemonic spider is path. And the goal of using paths is to identify multiple ways a particular task can be accomplished. And we should note that each path may not need to be a story. So here's an example from our library app. Maybe as a user, I can share key book information with my friends. Um, and the pass through that story may be, think of our typical share bug on a web page. I can copy a link. I can share through an email or click a link in the email opens my email client, or I can share to all of the various socials or some body of the various socials that are important to my customer or to my product manager, product owner. Um, so some paths can be grouped. Sometimes paths can be the story can be the single story, but the paths can be split as the acceptance criteria. Two things that I want to highlight here. First, when we code when we're coding things along paths, one thing we may need to watch out for is that we may need to code a framework or the first initial set of behavior, and then we can code each interaction. So what you'll see sometimes is I've split my stories for sharing key book information along paths. So I have a story for, as a user, I can share key book information by using the copy link. And then I have, as a user, I can share key book information by clicking an email link. Or I can do it through all the socials. Each of those store is a separate story. What you may find is that the team sits down and points. They say, okay, well, let's do the email one first, and because it's the first one, we're going to estimate that as 3 story points, for example, because we have to set up the framework. We have to set up the GUI bug, or however we need to do this in order to set up the connections. Another common example for this is if I'm setting up payment options for a e-commerce site. I want to accept payments by Visa, by MasterCard, by American Express. Maybe I want to accept payments by Stripe or Square or PayPal, however we want to integrate with the various payment processors. And first first pass the story has to include getting payment amounts and making sure payment amounts are correct, and invoices are tracked appropriately, and then setting up that first payment. So it's a larger story. And then each additional payment method then becomes a 1 point story. When we put that in the backlog with a story, with one thing with a small number, or one thing with a larger number of story points and others with small, we run a couple of risks. One is that the product manager just says, oh, well, copy link's only a 1 point story, and we've got a little slack in this next upcoming sprint, so we'll drag that in, not recognizing that the framework would still have to be developed. We run a similar risk if we're finishing a sprint early and somebody just wants to drag that bring that story in. The second risk is that the product owner may not recognize at all that there is this conditional linkage between stories, because some part needs to be done first. Now, we have strategies for that. We could split the framework out by itself. The drawback to that is we're not able to necessarily demonstrate the value to the customer. One strategy that I've seen for this that can be useful is to do conditional points or conditional estimates on our stories. So as we split our stories by paths, note somewhere. Easier if you're using physical cards, a little bit harder if you're using Asana or Jira. But note that that the points are conditional. That for this group of linked stories, that if it's the first story, it's going to take X number of points. If it's the second to end story, it'll take a smaller number of points. So that's a way to handle stories that we are able to split into smaller stories, but we may not be able to make them truly independent, that there may be some link dependency. And finally, path is really useful when we have compound stories. When a story is made up of multiple actions that a user wants to have with our system, multiple payment methods, multiple sharing options, can be useful if we have multiple filter options, or multiple activities. Anytime we have multiple activities through a single approach at getting value. I want to return to the story from the computerized lab device. As a user of some device, I need the device to self-correct if it detects that measurements are out of the accepted tolerance. And we want to size that to to the size of our iteration. But this is not a compound story, it's a complex story. Um, it does have two parts. It does have detect the measurements and self correct. The problem when my friend went to separate this, try to separate and split this story, was that the effort involved in detect the measurements was the vast majority of their estimated effort to allow the machine to meet this goal of self correcting. So they could, in theory, say, okay, self correct is its own story. Once we can detect that the measurements are out of the accepted tolerance, then we have the factor that we need to use in order to correct the machine automatically. But the problem is their estimated effort for detecting the measurement was was approximately two full iterations at the iteration size for the team that they had working on it. Sometimes there is just no way around recognizing that you're going to have a story that cannot be split. Um, That said, paths is only one more of the tools that we can use. Very useful for compound stories, sometimes not possible at all for complex stories. The next letter in the mnemonic is interfaces. So in this time, our goal is to focus on one interface, one hardware constraint, or one external system interaction. So an example here would be, as a user, I want to be able to access my personal library from a standard browser, so I can use the computer in my office or where most of my books are stored. Or I want to, in order to access my personal library as a user in a bookstore, I want to be able to view my book list on a Wi-Fi connected phone or tablet. So we can split that story, and there are different implications to our UI design or to some of the interactions that a user might have with a story, whether we need to be responsive or not, depending on how our product owner prioritizes those two stories. And I also wanted to highlight, in case you were looking for a different story format, this second story of in order to access my personal library, that goes back to using that hunting the value format that we talked about in the brief history of user stories. Um, After interfaces, a next dimension we can split our stories on is the data. So here we want to deliver smaller increments of value by considering simplifying or restricting the data that is supported. A good example here is to think about filtering. So as a user, I want to be able to filter a book list in order to view specific subsets. That's a pretty big story all by itself. But we can filter that by the different data that we know that we're collecting by about the books. So we can do that as a separate story if I want to be able to filter the book by genre or by type, by fiction or nonfiction. We can list out all of the various categories or metadata that we have about our book. Um, Again, perhaps we do an initial version of the story that processes only that subset of the data that will ultimately need to be supported. And the key thing here is we can provide some value by filtering in just one or two or three of these subsets without having to build out a full complicated filter UI. Um, it is possible though that our product owner could come back and say, well, we want to be able to filter by a combination of up to three filter criteria. That's a great story. Um, it's a story that we'd want to look at again back on that dimension from Invest of whether that's actually an independent story or whether it's a conditional story, whether there's prerequisites that we have to create before we can fully estimate and then build out that user story. Um, our last dimension then is around rules. And this is, we can implement a simpler version by relaxing particular rules, validation rules, business rules, and then in a later iteration handle more complex scenarios. Um, so a couple of examples here. As a user, I can enter a comment about a book so I can recall its details later. Um, that that story is part of could be part of a larger story that included the word safely. I want to be able to safely enter a comment about a book. Safely might be something that's a constraint by our security person. So we split that into two stories so that in one story, our first story, we just, man, can we even interact with the database? Can we get the UI interactions all the way down to data being stored and build out that story alone? And then we later come back and say, as the hosting administrator of our library application, I want all free text inputs to be sanitized to reduce the potential attack surface. And in negotiation with our product owner, we may decide that we want those stories to be flipped, that the sanitized inputs may be the most important story, and it may be worth a spike to do. Is there to determine whether there's a sanitization framework that we want to apply to our UI to make sure that all inputs coming in, whether there's middle tier um, annotations or a library that we want to integrate to make sure that the middle tier is validating all of our user inputs. Another example, as a user, I can save an ISBN for future use. That's a great user story. Again, it gets our interaction from the UI all the way down to the database. That may ignore a business rule that we have that we only want to allow entry of valid ISBNs, or that we just want to warn that an ISBN's not found and allow the user to save an ISBN that's not found, but we want to have a warning so that the user knows that, hey, we couldn't find that particular ISBN. And so as a user, I can receive a warning if I entered an ISBN that's not found in an online ISBN database. And another way that I want to point out again that these techniques all may be linked. This last story of being able to receive a warning if it's not found in an ISBN database, that may be, depending on the size of your team, the existing knowledge of your team, that might be a story where a spike is appropriate. There may be an information gathering spike so that we can understand what free or paid ISBN database services are available or web services are available. So we can go back to the product owner and say, we know that there's this free service, but it has these constraints. We can only support X number of users, or our requests get throttled after a certain number of requests, or we can pay for a service that removes those constraints, and then let the product owner decide with the business which of those options is the option that is appropriate for the goals of the software overall. So those are the techniques laid out in Spider. And I want to wrap things up with a couple of just short things to point out. The first being, when I started developing, and we were doing lots of big design up front and lots of waterfall, the typical way we divided our requirements out was in a horizontal method, very much like construction. We pour the whole foundation, we'd lay the exterior, load-bearing walls, add a roof, add the interior walls, do plumbing, electrical, and very, very horizontal. And you often see stories split in a horizontal way. In life or death situations, doing big design up front may be appropriate. You may be tempted to feel like the only way to split your stories is horizontally. You end up with stories like this. We split a report generation story along. As an admin, I want to have robust data aggregation logic so the reports are accurate and comprehensive. I want an API to fetch the report data. I want a user-friendly interface to display the reports. I've worked on a lot of teams where horizontal stories are common. The problem with horizontal stories is integration. When we have a habit of making of horizontal stories, we end up with Franken features. And this is very clearly a pedalable bicycle. It might get you to the store, or it might get you down to the train to do your commute by train, but it's probably not the best delivery of value. And it represents all of the different points where integration became difficult as the different teams built those different layers. Instead, if you go back through the stories that we did with Spider, you'll find that most of the stories were split vertically. They were split in layers, just like a layer cake. We take thin vertical slices all the way from our top level of interaction, be that our UI, or if we're a web service developer, from our web service to our database, to our storage, with our middle tier business rules in the middle. But we do small vertical slices that deliver value to the customer, and then we can iterate multiple times and add the additional features that we need. Examples of for our vertical slices for our reporting story is I can generate a basic report showing daily login counts, or I can generate a detailed report including user actions with page views and feature usage, or I can apply filters so that reports to the reports so that I can focus on a specific area of data or interest. And just again, each story focuses on the end-to-end functionality. It's fully integrated, can be tested, validated, and released to users. Now, I'm not going to go through the individual smells. I'll share some resources, and these are just a few of the smells. But um, if you pick up the book User Stories Applied, it has a catalog of smells that include these and others. But there's some things to watch for. That if stories are too small, they're broken down too granular. A symptom is that we have lots of overlapping work and we need to revise estimates. Gold plating can be a smell where the developers feel like they have the freedom to add their own scope to stories. Sometimes that's because stories aren't defined well. Sometimes that's caused by the team just feeling like they can interpret stories very liberally. Too many details. Stories are overly complex, making them too lengthy. And sometimes with so many details, they're specifying implementation details that stifle our creativity, our flexibility to develop solutions. Um, One coach in a workshop I attended once said to the participants, um, recommended that we use physical cards, not electronic cards or not electronic systems for our story workshops. And the primary reason was that if you run out of space, that's an indication that you need to use a smaller card. And everybody laughed, but really the point was, um, stories need to be small. If you've got too many details, you've likely dived into implementation. And again, this is also a problem with diving too far down into the backlog or putting too much detail in your backlog. The further down you are in your backlog, the less detail you need in your stories. So to wrap up, again, a couple of resources. I am not I am not necessarily an expert in all of this. I'm just sharing the experience that I have, that I've developed over, I don't know, probably 3,000 stand-ups, 500 or so backlog refinement meetings and sprint kickoffs, over multiple teams over many years. There are others who have a lot more information about this. Obviously, the two books that we pointed out, User Stories Applied and User Story Mapping. I do want to highlight Mountain Goat Software, which is the site also by Mike Cohn and his compatriots. I would recommend that you sign up for if you're interested in user stories and getting better at doing user stories, I would recommend that you sign up for the weekly tips newsletter at Mountain Goat Software. First of all, the weekly tips are valuable in and of themselves. But one of the things that you'll get notified of in those weekly tips newsletters is upcoming webinars. And about every quarter, and there should be due for one. I suspect there will be one in the first 1 or 2 weeks of November. Mountain Goat Software hosts a Write Better User Stories webinar. It's free. It's listed as an hour. You have to be a registered participant in order to get the later recording. Um, if you if you decide to sign up for that, and I would highly recommend it, make sure you book 2 hours in your calendar. They do the webinar. It's pretty much the same webinar with minor revisions every quarter, but the second hour, Mike and people on his staff take questions from participants, just random questions about particular stories or particular problems, particular issues with pointing or estimating, issues with splitting, and that hour is tremendously valuable. Um, a final note about user story mapping: if you're an audiobook person and you have an Audible account, I believe that user story mapping is included with your account. If you're doing a currently paid account, the account where you get 1 credit a month or whatever, you don't have to spend a credit on user story mapping. You can just add that to your library. And so with that, that's the end of the presentation of splitting user stories and techniques for splitting user stories without pulling your hair out and being overwhelmed by the complexity. I want to turn it. First of all, I want to open the floor to questions if there are any questions, and turn the time also back over to the hosts for our next activities. Oh, we've got a question here from Rob Richardson about what do I think about story point inflation? Actually, I'd be interested to hear what anybody else on the call thinks about story point inflation. I may be, as I've moved up to being a kind of a senior leader, I may have some opinions that are a little bit different about that from those that are in the trenches. Does anybody have any ideas or comments about story point inflation?
I'll add one if you don't mind. I've got an opposite point. It's about deflation. So it comes down to like what I've noticed at times, and it comes down to how people are evaluated. If the major benchmark of evaluation is the team success, you're a part of possibly a scrum team. So it's either the team wins or the team fails. It's not individual. That can possibly remove the desire to inflate. However, there's a negative approach. It's when so like maybe there's not that pressure in regards to delivering repeatable results in regards to individual contributions. Well, then earlier career professionals with less experience might be overly optimistic and always think of like the sunny day scenario, and there might actually be deflation. So I've noticed that with like if you're able to sort of have that team dynamic, it's possible that newer career professionals typically only think of the sunny day scenarios. And like I noticed that when you adjust the estimations of, they're more likely to go up. Rarely do they go down because they're always thinking glass half full versus half empty.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I've certainly seen, and this can be a factor. The deflation or underpointing stories can be um, can be a problem, particularly with newer teams or teams that are just experimenting with stories. It's easy to forget how complicated some work can be. One a symptom of that, and if you wanted to call it a smell, would be um, frequently carrying over stories or frequently having to drop stories from your iteration. Would say that that's something where the team needs to go back and reevaluate the way they're estimating. Um, Rob's shared on the chat that that's his experience as well, and that in his experience, actually, Rob, do you want to just come off mute and share your experiences a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I was in a team where management was really, really not helpful. They were trying to measure velocity, increase velocity, trying to, get a bigger velocity number. And the only way that the team was able to handle fatigue and exhaustion was story point inflation. And so in my experience, if we start looking at manipulating story points to achieve managing up, then it's an indication, a smell that management is rotten.
Yeah. Well, as a person who's on that side, I certainly hope that my management's not rotten. And so let me share, I guess, my opinion a little bit, and that is, um, I think points and velocity are incredibly useful um, as a planning tool, as a way to get a sense of what can be delivered when. When it becomes a metric that we try to screw or adjust or tighten or loosen, I start to get really concerned. So how do I approach points and points and velocity? I do find it interesting, and I do track the velocity of teams that work for me. But what I'm looking for is, um, was there significant carryover, or were there significant items pulled in and added? Did we get things done early? And looking for patterns for that. And if there's patterns, then my first assumption, for instance, if we're carrying over work, then my first assumption is we're not splitting stories small enough. We're not taking into account the various complications, and we're not taking into account interruptions. It's a planning and estimation coaching activity that needs to happen. If we're pulling in points pretty frequently, then again, that's a coaching item on the other side to say, are there ways that we're sandbagging our counts, and can we get to where we're more consistently hitting what our expected velocity is? Um, I want to avoid right off the bat, ever telling a team that they need to increase their velocity. Um, if they're going to increase their velocity, then there's something about the way that we're working that also needs to change. I either need to add team members or do something to make the work more productive, and that's not the responsibility of the team. So, any other comments on point inflation or deflation?
I really love that approach, and I love that you're taking ownership of it. A lot of times when I see inflation or deflation, management has already determined that they're right, and their goal is to whip the developers until they agree. So I love that you've identified that, yeah, if there's inflation, if there's deflation, if there's carryover, then oftentimes what it means is that management needs to be retrospective. I love it.
Yeah. Well, I joke with my CTO that one of the key drivers of my behavior is to do things that reduce my personal pain. And one of the things that's most painful to me is the hiring process and recruiting process and onboarding process. And so I'm aware that if I'm whipping my developers and making it an unpleasant place for them to work, then I'm just increasing my own pain, and I'm going to do everything in my power to avoid that. Let's see. Caleb posted a link. According to Alan Holub, it's been proven that the number of stories is more accurate at estimating effort than story points. And an interesting video. I've seen, I've heard that point. I don't know if I've seen that particular video. Do you want to add any more context to that, Caleb?
Just a little bit of background. So effectively what he does in this video, and I think there's another one that I liked equally well, but is basically go over some projects where they had looked and said, okay, this project was behind by whatever, 9 months. So let's see if we can create a model that is, or should say, that better estimates how long it is going to take a project to complete. And what they found is that as long as they were making stories as small as they could, and they were tracking work in roughly the sizes that they expected them, to be in the future, that the number of stories in the backlog, though they're not representative of the number that would actually have to be completed in the end, because of course more will be added over time. It was the best possible estimate of how long it would take for a project to be completed. And to that end, then if that is the best estimate, he argues, why take the time to do story points and things? Now, perhaps I was spoiled coming from a Kanban background at my prior job, where like 2 weeks before we were getting ready to finish up some work, we would start having, backlog grooming. We start talking about what's highest priority and, bargain about priorities. Like, okay, well, this one's higher priority, but yeah, it's going to take 6 months. This one's not highest priority, but we have something ready in pretty short order that may provide value to the company.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth a watch. I don't remember all the details because it's been a while, but it's something I really have wanted to try and have just never been either in an environment that would allow it, or I haven't had the time to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I can add kind of a concurring voice to that. And it kind of gets back to what I was saying when we talked about estimatable and the lunar logic estimation cards, where everything was a one or too freaking big or too frighteningly big and no freaking clue. Um, I think there's I think there are teams that work really well with points. I think there's teams that work really well with t-shirt sizes. Some teams work really well with hour or day estimates, and some teams and environments work really well with just saying we've broken the features down as small as we can, and this is what we're just gonna tackle them. One important point to make, I think, from what Caleb said, is the use of stories and the principles of defining a story well and splitting stories. Um, this is not a Scrum specific idea. It's not an XP specific idea. It's not a Kanban specific idea. It's a valuable idea in and of itself, independent of the development and management methodology you use. And again, recognizing that our primary owners of defining stories are usually some kind of product owner or customer. But as developers, the better we can get at defining and refining stories, the easier our lives get, the better the environment is for the developers that work with us. So.
And to try and I believe there's one thing I'm guessing that you would say is true, and that is you talked about all these teams having just success with different patterns. is it true that all of those teams who were successful were really good at the let's see, I think you called it wasn't collaboration, discussion, like your CCC cards, right? Basically the whole, you have to have the discussions, as that placeholder, regardless of what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. The communication. It's
Yes, that's what it was.
it's card communication and confirmation. And that communication really is key. Um, and yeah, probably the biggest team smell I've experienced in managing teams is teams that don't communicate well or feel like they have to document every tiny detail because they're afraid of being misunderstood, or maybe it's a cover your butt kind of thing. Those environments are difficult to work in, and it's difficult for a team to be successful in that. But back to invest, just like all the other factors in invest, estimatable is a target that we're looking for, and the actual technique for the estimation and whether we use estimates or not. There's a significant movement out there that for no estimates. That's negotiable on the part of your team and your stakeholders. So I don't see anything else in the chat. I do want to be sensitive to people's time, so where we're at. So I think we should probably hand it over for our closing activities. But you can certainly go to the meetup and add discussions on the meeting in the meetup, or you can reach out to me at X, at Geek Cyclist is a pretty good way to keep in touch with me. Although I will warn you that I do sometimes get relatively political as elections approach on X. So it's my weird. It's a weird way that I've separated the things that are political and tech seem to go on X and not Facebook and other socials for me. So. So that's it for me.